User administration in Linux. The Linux operating system is what we call a multi-user operating system. What this means is that multiple users can work on the same computer at the same time. But just because a couple users are using the same computer doesn't mean they have access to each other's files and directories. That's because Linux provides mechanisms that are designed to give users control over who can access their files and directories. Furthermore, each user can customize their environment independent of other users. So in some sense, each user feels like they're on their own computer. Linux system administrators must understand the utilities that are available for user management. So let's get started and look at these. A Linux system administrator must know how to add and remove users from the system, and must also know how to modify existing user accounts. A system administrator could be called on to do something like reset a user's password because they forgot it, or change somebody's default shell. Then we're going to talk about groups. We use groups in Linux when we want to build collections of people. So perhaps there's a few people and they're all working on the same project, and they want to share some files for efficiency reasons. So what we can do is we can build a group of these people and then alter the file permissions so that the group has access to the files. Since they're members of the group, they would therefore have access to the files. We can also set up the file permissions, which we also call modes, so that people can't access your files or directories. When we talk about users in Linux, what we're really talking about are user accounts. The set of attributes that we associate with an account are a username, which must be unique, a default shell, a default group, possibly an expiration date, and a few other things that we'll look at later. We already know about the special account, the super user account. This is the only account that can add, remove, and modify users in the system. The utilities that we're going to use to add, remove, and modify users are the user add utility, user del, which just stands for user delete, and user mod, which stands for user modify. These are all in the user sbin directory with a bunch of other system administration utilities. We can also set it up so that when we add a brand new user using user add, a bunch of default config files are copied into that user's new home directory. These files are copied from the etc skell directory. Skell just stands for skeleton. So in some sense, these are the bare bones config files that a user would need to get started on your system. Now, an experienced user might not need these files. He might prefer to write his own. But for an inexperienced user, these are really helpful to get started using the system. Okay, so let's do some user adds and user deletes so we can see how this all works in practice. I'm going to right-click on the desktop. I'm going to pull up a new terminal. Okay, I'm going to switch over to be the root user. Now you can see I'm the root user on this machine. Before we actually add a user, let's look at the defaults for user add. So what this means is if I don't specify a group when I add a new user, they're automatically put into the group 100. If I don't specify a location for their home directory, it's put under the /home directory tree. These two fields have to do with account expiration. Neither of them are being used right now, and we can tell that because the inactive flag is -1, which says it's not being used, and the expire field is blank, which says it's not being used. However, if there was a date in this expire field, that would be the default expiration date for every account that I create. Now, when an account expires, all that really happens is the user is just disabled from logging in. All their files are still there, and the user still owns those files. They just can't log into the system. So you could unexpire an account or reinstitute an account, and when the user logged in, everything would be just like it was when they left. All their files would be in the same place, their configurations would be set the same, and everything else. Now, if the inactive flag was a positive number, that would be the number of days after the account expires that the account would be permanently removed from the system. All the files would be deleted, the user ID would be gone, everything would be gone. Here you can see the default shell is bash, and the default skeleton directory is an etc skell like we were just talking about. So let's add a user to the system. I'm going to add a user named Lisa to the system. Now what just happened there when I did this was two files were modified, the etc password file and the etc shadow file. Lisa's home directory was created, and a few configuration files were copied into Lisa's home directory. So let's see again firsthand exactly what happened. We'll go into the home directory tree and do an ls, and you can see there's a directory for Lisa now. I go into the Lisa directory, and I list all the files with an ls-a command, and you'll see all these user config files. The reason we know these are user config files is because they all start with a period or a dot. Okay, so these are all what we call dot files. Okay, if I do an ls-a on the etc skell directory, you'll see the exact same files in there. So these were the files that were copied from the etc directory because etc was the default skeleton directory. One thing that didn't happen when I did the user add is Lisa doesn't have a password still, and she can't log into the system without a password. So let's set a password for the user Lisa. And we do that with the password command. We say password Lisa. Note here that the root user is the only person that can change a password for someone other than himself. Okay, so I'll set the password for Lisa, retype it to make sure I did it right, and you'll see everything's been updated successfully. So now Lisa can log into the system and use her account. Now let's go up and look at the etc password and the etc shadow files. So I'm going to print out the etc password file. Before I actually hit enter here, I want to explain that the etc password file has one entry for every single user on the system. There's a whole bunch of users on the system that are created when you install the system. A bunch of those accounts you can't even log into, and they're there for other reasons that we'll talk about later. But suffice it to say that there's one line for every user on the system, and there's a whole bunch of users, so they're going to scroll up the screen. But I don't really care, because I just want to look at the very last line of the etc password file. Okay, so you can see down here is the last line of the file, and it's for our brand new user, Lisa. So let's look at what each field in this line means one by one. The first field is the username, Lisa. The next field is the password. Now, I didn't type X for a password there. That would be a really bad password. But you can see that X is the password in the password field for all these users. What that means is that the password is not stored here. It signifies that the password is stored over in the etc shadow file, which we'll look at next. Okay, the next field is the user ID. Lisa's user ID is 501. And the next field is the group ID. So you can see Lisa's group ID is also 501. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, didn't you just show me that the default group ID was 100? You're right, I did. But Red Hat doesn't use that default. What Red Hat does is it uses what's called user private groups. Every user is given a group so that the group ID is equal to the user ID. So every user has sort of their own private group. And when we talk about groups later, we'll see why user private groups are so advantageous. Okay, the next field is a comment, so in between those two colons there is blank because we didn't add a comment for Lisa. Up above here I used it for my full username, or my full name. The next field is Lisa's home directory, and the next field is the default shell for Lisa. So these are all the attributes of the account that we were talking about before. A username, a user ID, a group ID, a password, home directory, and a default shell, things like that. Okay, now let's go over and look at that etc shadow file. Again, the etc shadow file has one entry for every user on the system, and again, I only want to look at the very last line of the etc shadow file, so I don't care that they all scroll by. Okay, and this last line, again, is for our new user, Lisa. I just want to look at the first two fields here. The first field is the username, Lisa, and the next field is the password. Now, I didn't type that password when I did that. I couldn't type that fast, first of all. But secondly, I actually don't want the real password stored here. This is the encrypted version of the password. This file, etc shadow, is not readable by anybody on the system but root. But if somehow somebody got a glimpse of this file and Lisa's password was in here in plain text, that person could break into Lisa's account. This way, with the encrypted version of the password, I don't know how you could figure out Lisa's password from this, but if you could, you're really good, and you've got to step up on me. Before we add another user, let's look at the different options that we can use with user add. So we'll type man user add to see the manual page. And you can see there's a bunch of options that we can use with user add. C, D, E, F, and so on. The C option is for the comment. That's the field for Lisa that was blank. That's the field I was using for the full username. You can see I can set an expiration date with the -E option. I can set an inactive time with the -F option. And if you scroll down through this man page, you'll see the exact form that you can put the date in and the time and so on. Okay, so let's add a new user. Let's add the user Joe Schmo to our system, and we'll give him a username of Joe. Okay, so now I added the user. Again, if we look at this, you'll see there's a new directory that's been created named Joe. There's files in that directory, all those files that were copied from etc. Again, the password file has been modified, but here, look, you can see the comment field has been filled in, unlike for Lisa where it was blank because we didn't use the -C option. But we'll go back and modify that for Lisa in a little bit. Okay, let's look at user delete now. We'll look at the man page for user delete, and you'll see there's only one option for user delete, the -R option. What the R option does when you delete a user is along with deleting the user, it deletes all the files in the user